lot of people don't even know that the Rastafarian movement, or if you want to call that a faith, revolved around a man. This wasn't admiration of a man. This wasn't he provides value to a community. This was idolatry. That's prime breeding grounds for the devil. People think of the devil and think of like horns, a black cloud. But no, Lucifer comes to you in the form of everything you've ever wanted.
Fabricated popular culture portrays Rastafari as a being of mythological grandeur and benevolence. As with all things mainstream, this is an absolute inversion, entirely contrasting the reality of his tyrannical reign. Not only is the perception that Selassie was a champion for black people completely distorted and not supported by the facts, but in reality he was the typical murderous warlord, backed and sponsored by the United Nations, and whose army was equipped with Western rifles and trained by the Israeli and USA militaries in so-called pacification campaigns. Rastafari brutally terrorized the religious and cultural minorities of Ethiopia, abolishing their power structure and even their language, and he conquered his neighbors with equally tyrannical fervor. But if you ask the average Rasta NPC about Selassie's legacy, you get a brainwashed, pre-programmed response very much like this.
Emperor Haile Selassie the first, Jah Rastafari. Blessed love, salutations. Yes, I'm a white guy. Many of y'all probably just see the outside of the reggae music, the image of his king, Bob Marley with the dreadlocks, but don't know that if you was a real Rastafari brethren, you must love Haile Selassie. Research the man, the history of the amazing things that this man did in the world, not only for Africa and for black people, but for world peace, for the coming together of the human family. You are just amazing. Maybe you could understand why I say this is Christ in his kingly character. It might be hard for y'all to understand that, but sure, go look up some videos online and I'm sure you could figure it all out on your own.
Let's retrace the footsteps of this highly educated Rasta NPC and emulate his rigorous investigative research to figure the truth out. So, what does Wikipedia say about Selassie? Quote, Haile Selassie attempted to modernize the country through a series of political and social reforms, including the introduction of Ethiopia's first written constitution and the abolition of slavery. End quote. What Wikipedia appears to have forgotten to mention is that not only was Selassie a slave owner himself, but he actually comes from a lineage of barbaric slave masters. As a matter of fact, according to Richard Kapuscinski's book, The Emperor, Downfall of an Autocrat, Selassie even had a slave whose job was to slide a pillow under the feet of the towering 5 feet tall King of Kings every time he would sit on his throne so that his feet wouldn't dangle hilariously. This same slave was also ordered to bow down to Selassie every time the clock marked the hour. But we must be fair and give the King of Kings credit though. After all, he was simply preserving the family tradition. The following excerpt describes the modus operandi of Rastafari's army as well as that of his direct ancestors and imperial predecessors, taken from a scientific paper titled The Ethiopian State, Authoritarianism, Violence and Clandestine Genocide, published by Asafa Jalata, a professor of sociology and African studies at the University of Tennessee. Quote, "The conduct of Abyssinian armies invading a land is simply barbaric. They contrive a sudden eruption more often at night. At daybreak, fire begins. Surprised men in the huts or in the fields are three-quarter massacred and mutilated, as the soldiers chop off the right hands of men and the right breasts of women. After reducing to captivity the surviving children, women, and men, the soldiers lead the frightened herds of animals toward the camp and take away the grain and the flour, which they load on the shoulders of their prisoners, spurred on by blows of the whip. Then they destroy the harvest, and glutted with booty and intoxicated with blood, go to walk a bit further from the devastation. This is what they call civilizing a land." End quote.
Do you see it yet?
Ironically, Marcus Garvey, the Freemason responsible for convincing Jamaicans that Selassie was Christ returned in the flesh in the end, after the seed of the Rastafarian Psyop had already been successfully sown, performed a classic Freemasonic double-speak maneuver and expressed disgust for the pseudo-messiah, condemning him as a great coward and a slave master. The following excerpt was taken from an article written by Marcus Garvey, published in the Black Man magazine's edition of April 1937, titled "The Failure of Haile Selassie as Emperor," which was later reprinted in the Marcus Garvey and Universal Negro Improvement Association papers in 1991. Quote, "When the facts of history are written, Haile Selassie of Abyssinia will go down as a great coward who left the millions of his countrymen to struggle through a terrible war that he brought upon them because of his political ignorance and his racial disloyalty. Selassie is but a slave master. What right has the emperor to keep slaves?" End quote. Later, in the same article, Garvey refers to Selassie as a, quote, "white, loving emperor who liked to chain and flog black men, and whose brutality to them gave Mussolini the cause to fool the world that he was bestowing a blessing upon the people of Abyssinia by freeing them." End quote.
Do you see it yet?
Ask anyone what first comes to mind when thinking of Ethiopia, and most people will mention famine right away. But did you know that it was precisely Selassie and his tyrannical policies that were responsible for the infamous Wollo famine? And did you know that in 1973, while hundreds of thousands of Ethiopians were dying of starvation, Selassie spent $35 million to celebrate his 80th birthday? Those 35 million would be the equivalent to over 200 million today. Again, from Richard Kapuscinski's book, The Emperor, Downfall of an Autocrat, quote, "The development was a hoax. 40 times as much was spent on the army and police as on agriculture. Eventually, a hideous famine set off a chain of unrest." End quote. From an article written by Johannes Voldemariam, titled "The Real Legacy of Haile Selassie," quote, Some of his dedicated followers would be dismayed to learn that Selassie revered not his own people, but the Europeans and Americans who were routinely invited to his lavish parties in his palace. End quote. And when Selassie was finally replaced with Mengistu, the exact same brutal dictatorship was resumed. From Michel Arong's account of Eritrea's emancipation titled I Didn't Do It For You, quote, Mengistu blocked the distribution of food in areas he considered politically suspect. Instead of going to feed the starving, Western food aid was unloaded on the docks of Massawa and then reloaded onto Soviet ships in return for more arms. End quote.
Do you see it yet?
Since the death of the Rastafarian god caused absolute cognitive dissonance and a profound crisis of faith in its cult members, Masonic Marley was given the mission to perform damage control through the popular song Jah Live. Still to this day, Rastafarians claim that Selassie never really died. Just look at this.
Imagine even him was passed away. Or at least, like in the realm we live in, we would say he was non-existent, even though we know that's a lie. Rastafari can't die.